Hi, I'm Stuart. Welcome to my video on kayaking through Desolation Sound, the Discovery Islands, the Johnstone and Queen Charlotte Straits, and the Broughtons Archipelago in beautiful British Columbia, Canada. I've broken the video into two parts so that you can easily find the content that you're interested in. The first part contains information about planning and preparation for the trip. And the second part contains videos and photos from the trip itself. I'll put a place marker later on in the video so you can easily find that second part if that's all you're interested in. Oftentimes when I tell people that I spent a couple of months living off the grid in the Canadian wilderness, their reaction is, "What are you, nuts? Don't you like staying warm and dry? Don't you like on-demand pure water, hot showers, unlimited toilet paper? Didn't you miss Jen?" Yeah, I missed all those things, but it was totally worth it. I was able to spend that time surrounded by spectacular scenery, camped out in pine forests with moss carpets, and totally lived in the moment. And this is not the first time I've done things like this. I've done quite a few 2-week trips in the San Juan and Gulf Islands and off the coast of Maine. And those trips always left me wanting more, wanting to spend more time out there. I'd heard about places like Desolation Sound and the Broughtons archipelagos where you could paddle for months among whales and spectacular scenery. I recently retired and I'm not getting any younger. So even when my paddling partner had to drop out at the last minute, I decided that now's the time to go. If I wasn't going to do it now, it probably was never going to happen. In the military, they say that proper prior planning precludes piss poor performance. And I know that there was a lot that I didn't know about where I was going, so there was a lot that I needed to learn. I initially went to the internet because it's fast, easy, and fun. But I didn't get the broad information that I needed to start planning. That could really only be found in books. And I love books, and this gave me a great opportunity to buy some more. Dennis Dwyer's book is probably the Bible on paddling the Inland Passage. He's got over 200 pages of information that will help you prepare for your trip. Includes information about what you need to take, what you can expect, flora and fauna you'll see along the way, and some history of the area as well. It's also got a day-by-day description of his trip from Bellingham all the way up to Skagway, Alaska. Really cool pictures in there as well too, albeit they're all black and white and not as nice as mine. But it gives you a sense of what you can expect. Robert Miller's book, Kayaking the Inside Passage, is also a great source of information for planning your trip. He also gives a much more detailed and extensive description of his paddle through the Inland Passage, so it's a really fun read. A couple of quotes of his that I really like. A good day is defined not by what happens to you, but by what you do with it. And survival is not so much a question of enduring adversity as of avoiding it, which I completely agree with. Perhaps my favorite book is this one by Susan Marie Conrad called Inside: One Woman's Journey Through the Inside Passage. There's not a lot of technical planning details in this one, but it really gave me a feeling for what it's like to paddle solo in an adverse environment. And Susan is a lovely person. I tracked her down through her website and reached out to her by email, and she actually wrote me back. Was very helpful, answered a lot of my questions. So I highly recommend this book. And if you are planning a cruise through the Inland Passage, if you can find one where she's speaking, I think you'll find that that will be a highlight of your trip. So once I had a sense of what I was getting myself into and made a decision that I really did want to go, I needed more information about the area that I was going to be paddling through. And I found this book, The Wild Coast 3, which is a kayaking, hiking, and recreation guide for the area that contains invaluable information about things like rapids and rough campsites and tides. Published in 2006, well, out of date, but you got to go with what you got. The associated maps are pure gold. They are the maps that I used on my deck for daily navigation, and I found them excellent. As I gathered information, I needed a way to easily access it while I was paddling. And the solution that I came up with was the Gaia GPS phone app. It allows me to pin information to specific points on the map so that I could access it when I needed it. I also used this as my GPS navigation solution, which was really valuable on a couple of times when I got turned around and lost. I've also used it when I was driving across country to mark things like Costco, where I could get cheap gas, and places of interest along the way where I might want to stop. People often ask me, what'd you eat out there? So I had to get 3 weeks worth of food into a small, thin boat, and a large part of my storage space was dedicated to food. In the morning, I ate oatmeal, which I would jazz up with dried fruit, nuts, and some powdered brown sugar or maple syrup, which you can get from Amazon. Made for quite a tasty way to start the morning. And if I had some free time before I started out in the morning, I would indulge in the luxury of a cup of instant coffee with powdered heavy cream and sugar. For lunch, I would often have just something that was easy to eat and had high in calories. So things like almonds, peanuts, dried dates, other dried fruit that I could get in large bags from Costco. Also, for the first week or so out, I could put hard cheese in the bottom of my boat, which acted as a refrigerator because the water was so cold. So I could have cheese, I could have bread, and I always carried a big stash of M&Ms, which I could also get from Costco in the big jars. So lunch was easy. It had to be sort of simple and fast, and something I could get easily out of the bow of my boat. And then for dinner, I would have a unique combination of things. I didn't carry a lot of freeze-dried food. It's expensive. There's also nothing green in those packages. So being out for 2 months straight, my body needed some vitamins, needed some green things. So what I did was I went to the grocery store. I got frozen chopped spinach, broccoli, and bell peppers, and borrowed my sister-in-law's dehydrator and dehydrated bags of those vegetables. Double bagged them, and I would start out my dinner by putting a mixture of those vegetables in a small pot, boiling water, and starting to rehydrate them. I would then add either instant mashed potatoes or rice from a package. I usually, that was one indulgence that I brought with me was pre-cooked rice, because cooking rice takes a lot of time and a lot of fuel. So I had to get something that was pre-cooked, and about a half of one of those packages, or a half of one of the packages of the mashed potatoes would suffice. I sometimes brought couscous and added that in as well too. And then to make things interesting, I would add the pièce de résistance, gravy. So that comes in a wide range of flavors: turkey, chicken, onion, beef, pork, and the somewhat mysterious brown gravy. But I would mix that in and to give it some flavor. And if I wanted to get really exotic, I could go Asian, stir fry, or beef and broccoli. I did buy a big number 10 can of the Mountain House meat lasagna and put that in a Ziploc bag to reduce the size of that. And that's how I would get sort of a real change of pace with something with a tomato base to it. But always put the vegetables in there as well too. For this trip, I needed an extremely versatile tent. I was going to be paddling through an area where the beaches were often rocky and didn't provide a place to set up a tent. And the forest floors were covered in deadfall. And when they did offer a small place to set up a tent, it was really small. So I needed a tent with a very small footprint that I could squeeze in to tight spaces. I needed to be able to sit up in it for my own comfort, so enough headroom that I could get up in the morning and move around. And I needed it to hang as a hammock because often there was literally no place to set up a tent. So I have slept in hammock tents before, and I just don't find them very comfortable. So I needed to find one that would allow me to lie flat when hanging up as a hammock. Because if I don't get a good night's sleep, I am not a happy camper. The solution that I found was this baby, the Ariel A1 by a small Canadian startup company called Opiongo. My apologies to the manufacturer and the people of Canada if I pronounce that incorrectly. The thing that makes this tent unique are the two bars at the short end of the base of the tent. Ratchet straps allow you to tension that platform so tightly that when you add an air mattress to sleep on, there's virtually no sag at all. I slept very comfortably in this tent for 60 days straight. It can be a little fiddly to set up above ground because you have to get it level, but it's so much more comfortable to sleep in above ground. It's so much easier to get in and out of above ground, and you don't have to worry about water coming in underneath you, regardless of how hard it rains. That I often found myself setting it up above ground, even when I had the option to easily set it up on the ground. So you really can set this tent up anywhere. This is a Forest Service site up in the middle of nowhere, north of Broughton Island, where someone had so recently built this table that it smelled like fresh milled lumber. And I couldn't resist the opportunity to set up somewhere that was truly unique. So, how do you get everything you need to live for 2 months into a skinny 17-foot boat? Well, the trick is to only take what you absolutely need and to minimize the size of what you take. Conventional wisdom says that you take all your stuff, divide it into two piles of equal weight, and put one pile in the bow compartment and one pile in the stern compartment. I tried to do that as much as possible, but I found that I really needed to put the stuff that I needed easy access to during the day in the bow and the stuff that I only needed at night in the stern. That way, when I pulled the boat up on a beach for lunch, I could easily get at my food, my toilet paper, and my chair. You may also notice that I have a Greenland style hull, which means it has a high pointy bow. There's a little bit of squeezy space up in the front there that I could use to stash some things that I hope that I would not need very often, like my tent repair kit and my extra pair of glasses. As I mentioned, it's really important to minimize the size of everything that you take. So I would go to the extreme of squeezing all of the air out of my Ziploc bags before I close them to ensure that the package would take no more space in the hull than absolutely necessary. Often I would have to paddle for 4, 5, 6 hours without getting out of the boat because there was just nowhere to land. So I had to keep essentials easily accessible. And I put them in my deck bag. So I would keep snacks, water, rain gear, GPS and camera, sunscreen, all of those sorts of things in the deck bag where I could get at them easily. I also kept my maps out clipped on top of the day bag, and all of my self-rescue gear attached to it. So I had a paddle float, a pump, and sponsons, which are these black things that look like little tubes on there, which are inflatable air bladders that can be attached to the side of the boat and give you extra stability in really rough weather. Stuff that I didn't need during the day would go in my stern compartment. That would be things like my tent, my sleeping bag and pad, tarp, all of the food that I needed for breakfast and dinner, and also my stove. On the top of the hull, between the cockpit and this hatch, I was able to strap 2.5-gallon water bladder and had another 2 gallons stashed in the cockpit behind my seat. Finally, on top of all of this went my paddles, my extra paddle, which I broke down and tied down on the back. Okay, enough of the boring background. Well, let's hear about the trip. Hi, welcome to my very homemade video summarizing a kayak trip that I am planning to take from here in Lund, British Columbia, up to Cape Caution, then cut inland along the Belize Inlet, explore around there for a little bit, and then paddle back here to Lund. Given myself 2 months to do that, which gives me plenty of time to hole up if the weather gets bad, or just stop and enjoy things along the way. I used to live on Whidbey Island, a little bit north of Seattle, and did several 2-week trips, kayak trips, around through the Gulf Islands and the San Juan Islands, and really loved it. There's no place on earth like the Northwest in the summertime. It's spectacular, great for kayaking, and I promised myself if I ever had the chance, I would go on a longer trip. So the plan is to take about 2 months to get up to the Belize Inlet, explore around, come back again. There's a couple of things that may cut that short. Weather being one. While the weather here is usually really nice, with the climate change going on, if it starts raining a lot and gets miserable, I'm going home. There's a lot of bears around here, so need to be real careful of them. The first precaution is to just really look around at campsites to see if there's any indication of bears. Make a lot of noise, and eat far away from my tent and keep my kayak far away from my tent. So hopefully all of those things will not attract bears, and if they do come along close, I have bear spray. But if that encounter doesn't end well, I may come home early as well too. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to go on this trip by myself. I had a friend who was planning to go with me but had to drop out very recently because of medical reasons. So I had to decide whether to go by myself or not go at all. And I remember hearing a story by a guy who sailed from Seattle to New Zealand solo. And he was going to go with a friend who had to drop out, and he was in the same situation that I am. He'd done a lot of solo sailing before, so he was competent, and decided to go. And he said when he was pushing off from the dock, somebody yelled to him, "Just don't do anything stupid." And he said that was the best advice he got from anybody on the whole trip, and he kept that in mind throughout the trip. And whenever he thought about doing something, he would ask himself if it was stupid. And if he thought there was any possibility that it was, he didn't do it. So I'm going to take that advice as well too. I'm going to, because I am prone to do some stupid things occasionally. There's a fine line between stupidity and stretching yourself and growing. So I'm going to have to be a lot more conservative on this trip and not do some of the stupid things that I probably would like to do. There are some pretty dicey areas around here, even though I'm going to stay in a fairly protected area of the inland passage. The straits between several of the islands between here and Port McNeill constrict, and a lot of water goes through them during the tidal changes. So all of those places really, I'll have to pass at slack tide, which is when the water is not moving. Dart through them, and then paddle up to the next one, wait for slack on that. There's a particularly nasty one at the neck of Desolation Sound before you have to go through to get into Desolation Strait, which are the worst, pretty the worst rapids on the coast. Real impressive. So that I'm going to have to be extremely careful of going through. Another thing that could send me home early would be to capsize. I have limited range of motion in one shoulder and cannot roll my kayak. So I have to be really careful not to get in the water. My understanding is you've got about 10 minutes once you're in the water to get back in the boat and right yourself. You start to lose fine motor control of your fingers in about 4 or 5 minutes, about 10 minutes, which makes it really hard to get back in the boat. And then after about 4 hours in the water, you're probably going to die of hypothermia. So it's really important that I get back in the boat quickly. I have a paddle float, which turns my paddle into a pontoon that will facilitate me getting back in the boat. I also have sponsons, which are inflatable air batters that attach to the side of the kayak, which make it much harder to roll. So if I am not careful enough and get caught out in some bad weather or some heavy seas, there's a couple of things that I can do to prevent tipping over and to help get back in the boat when I do. But primarily what I'm going to do is don't go in the water. And then the last thing is, you just don't know what you don't know. So there's always things out there that can get you that you don't know about or prepare for. I have been preparing for this trip for about 6 months, fairly intensely. Done a lot of research on the coast, have some great maps, have used Gaia GPS to save information about camping sites, possible camping sites, and water sources, navigation hazards, those sorts of things. So have a fairly detailed knowledge of the area, even though I've never actually been here before. The area I'll be paddling through is fairly uninhabited. So I need to carry everything with me that I'm going to need and eat. Water should be available along the way. I'll filter that to make sure that it's safe to drink. But there's only one place really that I can pick up food. That's in Port McNeill. So I'm going to paddle up there, about 2 weeks up there, resupply. I dropped off a month's worth of food there for the middle of the trip, and then on the way back, I'll stop by Port McNeill and pick up the last 2 weeks to paddle back here to Lund. But I would be surprised if I see a lot of people, or many people, or any people. For the most part on this trip, I'll be camping in undesignated or dispersed campsites, so I'll have to find them and camp there. So probably won't be anybody in the campsites. I will probably see some folks in boats, and we may be able to communicate back and forth. But largely, it'll be a trip of solitude. I have a Garmin GPS, which can summon help if I need it. So that makes it a lot safer than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. Spent today packing and repacking the boat, make sure that I could get everything in there, and making some tough decisions about what I could take, because there's just not a lot of space in this boat. So it's a little like playing the Oregon Trail game for real. We'll see if I pick the right stuff and can do without the things I left behind. So that's the plan. Stick around for the rest of the video and see what happens. That was the sound that woke me up every morning. I would usually set my alarm because it could take me up to 2 hours to get up, break camp, cook my breakfast, get packed, and get on the water. So I didn't want to lose too much of the morning. When the sound went off, I'd look out the window and see what kind of day I got. Jen couldn't really tell a lot of the time from the tent because the canopy overhead was so dense that I couldn't see the sky. British Columbia is a tropical rainforest, and so often I would have to get up out of my tent and walk down to the beach to see what kind of a day it was going to be. And they were always different. So I was off the grid most of the time. I usually did not have a weather forecast, so I never knew when I woke up in the morning whether I was going to be greeted with a beautiful day, with a day that started out foggy and cleared up and turned beautiful, or was crummy and was going to stay crummy. I wish I could say that this trip taught me how to dance in the rain, but didn't learn that. Rain sucks. I won't dwell too much on rain here, but I did get more than I expected. My experience living in Seattle was that by the 4th of July, the weather clears up and get as much beautiful weather in the summer as you do get crummy weather all the rest of the year. I was lured out of Lund by a beautiful day on my first day, and the next day it started raining and rained off and on for about 2 weeks to 3 weeks straight. On days when it was too crummy to paddle, I'd set up my large tarp, which was big enough to cover my tent and give me a space to set up a chair underneath. I'd pass the day reading, being present, and waiting for the rain to pass, which sometimes took 3 or 4 days. British Columbia is beautiful, even in the rain. And on those days when I was holed up, I would get out between showers, walk around, and just appreciate the beauty of my surroundings. Mornings, I'd wake up to beautiful scenery, the smell of pine trees, and the sound of the ocean on the beach. I'd get up, make myself a cup of coffee, some oatmeal with dried berries and maple syrup, and set about breaking down camp. Used an aerial A1 tent, which could be set up either hanging in the trees or on the ground as a self-standing tent. Gave me a lot of flexibility because much of the ground in British Columbia is covered with deadfall and moss, and there's very few flat places to actually set up a tent. Sometimes the first challenge of the day is just getting your boat in the water. BC can have extreme differences between high and low tide during the full moon phase. And sometimes a beach that is beautiful place to land in the evening at high tide can turn into a long haul out in the morning when the tide's out. Sometimes I had to just haul my boat down as far as I could get it in the morning, and then sit back, have a cigar, and wait for the tide to come in before I could actually get out on the water. The first day of the trip started out great. The skies were blue, the water was flat, and I was surrounded by beautiful mountains. This is the view from my cockpit. I have all my emergency gear and some food and snacks all easily accessible. So if I couldn't find a place to land, I could still reach them easily. Headed for the Kermay Islands, the crown jewel campsite in the Desolation Sound Marine Park. And this place lives up to its reputation. It is spectacular. It's also a great place to camp. There are a lot of platforms where you can easily set up a tent, and they all have sweeping panoramic views. Here's my thoughts after the first day of paddling. This is my first night, first campsite on the Kermay Islands in the Desolation Sound Provincial Park here in BC. Got a late start this morning, got up early. It took me a lot longer to pack the boat than I thought it was going to, but a lot less time to get here than I thought it was going to. Boat was a little heavy, a little low in the water, got sloshed by a wave, passing boat that doesn't normally happen. But after about an hour or so, it got into the rhythm and felt good. It's almost too hot today, too. It's a little cloudy now, but it's turned out really nice. The islands are spectacular, and there's glaciated mountains in the background, so just about as spectacular as you can ask for. Uh, I thought that the place would be packed, but it's not. Apparently, it's been raining a lot in Vancouver, and um, so I think there are a lot of people who just didn't come out. So I've got the whole island to myself, with the exception of one other couple who are very nice and I hardly see. So it's a beautiful, beautiful place. Kind of a hike up from my boat to the camping pads here, which makes it a little bit challenging. Um, and it is supposed to rain tomorrow. So I think I'm going to hole up here, stay for a day, and see what rain is like in this part of the country, and then move on from there. It did indeed start to rain the next day and continued off and on fairly consistently for the next 3 weeks. But I'm not going to dwell on that. When it wasn't raining, the morning was one of my favorite times of the day. The light was always beautiful. I'd wake up and take down my tent, make some coffee and some oatmeal for breakfast, and just enjoy the beauty around me. Since I seldom stayed in the same campsite for more than one night, each morning was different, and I tried to really spend some time enjoying the view. It was fun to watch the sun paint the trees different colors as it rose, and I was very thankful that since I was setting my own itinerary, I could take as much time to enjoy this as I wanted. And sometimes in the morning, when the water was very still, I'd be treated to reflections like this one. I love the peaceful stillness of the mornings and couldn't believe that I had most of these places all to myself. Sometimes in the morning, I'd see low-lying clouds or fog over the water. Usually that would burn off, but not always, which made for very interesting navigation and paddling during the day. I primarily navigated using a paper map and would paddle from point to point, keeping track of where I was on the map as I went along. I did have 3 GPSs with me, and thankfully only needed to use them 2 or 3 times to verify my position. So with my course set for the day, I'd hit the water. Nice mornings, I'd get to start the day by paddling through those reflections that I had seen earlier. And even when the weather wasn't great, there's always another beautiful view around the next corner. After leaving Desolation Sound Marine Park, my next challenge was to get through a series of rapids in the strait between Vancouver Island and the British Columbian mainland. The tides move huge amount of waters through these narrows that create whirlpools, whitewater, and even waterfalls. The trick to getting through these rapids safely is to arrive when the tide is turning and the water is not moving. I had tide tables for all of the rapids, but as I later learned, you need rapid tables, not tide tables. Who'd have thought? So as a result, I never passed through rapids during slack. The first set of narrows I had to make it through were at surge narrows, which is where I later found out is where people go to practice
Here's
their
the challenge.
whitewater kayaking skills.
I am at surge narrows. The water is flowing, the tide's coming in. I want to go against it, and I have to get up through these rapids somehow. I don't think I can paddle against them. I could wait for 6 hours until the tide changes and go through then, or I can try pulling the boat around this point into this shallow or into this calm bay here where I can continue to head out toward the ocean and against the tide. So that's what I'm going to try. We'll see what happens.
I got around the point, but after several attempts at paddling and pulling, I realized I couldn't get any farther. So I landed on a rock shelf in that little bay and started to make my dinner. As I mentioned, the tide was coming in, and I very quickly started to lose all of the ledge that I landed on. That night, the tide came in so high that there was no beach left, and I had to tie my boat to a tree and let her float free in the bay during the evening. I climbed up a big bank and was able to find a great place to hang my tent, so it turned out having a really good night. Coastal British Columbia is a temperate rainforest, and for a guy who grew up in the suburbs, this place is like Hobbit land. Moss, ferns, and funky mushrooms grow everywhere. Since the forest was so dense, I usually only saw land animals when I surprised them from the water. In the case of black bear encounters, that was just fine. There are two types of bears in British Columbia, grizzlies and black bears. Thankfully, I never had a grizzly bear encounter. This guy I watched from the shore, and he didn't seem particularly interested in me. But I did have another interesting black bear encounter. This bear story starts with water. I could carry about 4.5 gallons of fresh water with me, which I could make last for about 5 or 6 days if I was careful. So I was always on the lookout for freshwater sources. I saw a lot of water, but it was often like this, pouring out of the side of a hill and down onto a beach that I couldn't access. When I did find an accessible stream, the water was often tinted brown or tan from the deadfall tannins upstream. It gave the water a kind of tea flavor, which I became very fond of. You can see the fresh water here flowing into the green of the seawater. So back to the bear story. I was low on water when I found this stream, and there was much rejoicing. I could replenish my water supply, I could wash my clothes, and I could wash my stinking body. I was really excited when I landed here. I pulled my boat way up on the beach, dug out my water filtration kit and soap, leaving stuff strewn all over the ground, and rushed down to take full advantage of the water. About an hour later, I returned to my boat and noticed there was a bear walking between me and the shoreline. He didn't seem interested in either me or the food that I had left strewn around my boat. I don't know if he didn't smell the food lying around my boat or he just preferred to eat dead stuff washed
He came
up
by
on the
again the
shore
next
to what
morning
I was
as I was
eating.
cooking my
But
oatmeal.
either way, he left
So
me
I
alone.
banged on a pot to let him know that I was there. He gave me a glance over his shoulder as if to say, yeah, I know you're there, and you got nothing I want, which was just fine with me. Paddling along the shore, I'd occasionally surprise animals doing interesting things, like this deer eating seaweed. Nurse trees are another really interesting phenomenon. Decaying deadfall provides great soil for little bonsai trees to grow all over the place. It's so wet in British Columbia that there are giant banana slugs on the land. Paddling along the shore, the forest and the sea seem to mix, with barnacles growing on tree roots. And brightly colored starfish, sea urchins, and crabs forests back and forth grow in the shallows, the water and they're huge. This one is probably about 20 feet long. Kelp was my friend. It would show me which way the tide was running. More importantly, kelp beds gave me a place to rest. Even if I couldn't land, I could pull into a kelp bed, and no matter how fast the current was running, it would hold me in place. It was in the water that I saw some of the coolest things. One day when paddling in the Johnstone Strait, I pulled in for lunch, turned around, and saw this herd of porpoises cruising past me. They swam first one direction along the beach, turned around, and swam the other. So they may have been herding fish, but I really don't know. Paddling with humpback whales was an unexpected pleasure. One of my favorite campsites was along Active Pass, which is a humpback migration route. The humpbacks paraded past my campsite morning, noon, and night. I was able to sit out and watch them while I was eating dinner, fell asleep listening to them sound, and got up in the morning and had breakfast watching them go by. Even though they came really close to me when I was on the water, I never feared them. They didn't seem interested in me, and the chances of one coming up right underneath me were pretty small. Of course, orcas stole the show. They would pop up occasionally, and I had a chance to paddle with them several times. It was always cool.
This was the last time I saw them. I was heading home from the Broughtons and had just finished my oatmeal on a misty morning. They came slowly parading by, and I had them all to myself. Orcas come to British Columbia for salmon, seals, and sea lions. Not surprisingly, seals and sea lions were pretty skittish, as I guess I would be too if I was being hunted by an orca. I often had seals surface next to my boat, see their eyes get wide with surprise, and then dive away as quickly as they could. Sea lions were a lot more elusive. They would run. I was mostly alone out there, but there are a few hardy souls that make their living in the area. There's a lot of clear cutting that's done on crown lands. Fortunately, most of that I could not see from the water. If the logs are cut down by the water, they're taken down to the shore, bundled up, and then eventually towed away by tug. Occasionally I'd run across a fish farm. These are being phased out because it turns out they're great places for diseases to grow, and those diseases are easily passed off to the wild fish population. They make a lot of noise too, so I could hear them coming long before I saw them. Occasionally I'd paddled past a few folks who were living and making a living off the grid. I met one of these very interesting people at a campsite, and I will introduce you to them later. I paddled past several First Nations villages where I could see their totem poles and lodges from the water. This area is a playground for Vancouver's rich and famous. I paddled past a lot of huge yachts cruising around, but sometimes it just takes too long to get to the cabin by a boat, so you gotta take your seaplane. There were a few floating marinas around that catered to the yachties, and I always made a point of visiting them. Since most of these marinas were built on floats, it made accessing their docks from a kayak somewhat challenging. But I could almost always get water and ice cream there, which made me highly motivated to scale the docks. And when there was a place for me to land at these marinas, I'd always use the back servant's entrance. Every 3 weeks or so, I would start to run out of food and head back to Port McNeill and my food stash. I love this place. There's a campground close to town with hot showers and a laundry. The incredibly accommodating harbor master let me stash all of my food in his office where I could access it whenever I came in. Port McNeill has great restaurants and coffee shops with free Wi-Fi where I could catch up on my email and what was going on in the rest of the world. And it's a working port, so there were hardware and marine stores where I could get the material I needed to repair or replace my equipment. I got to hang out one Saturday with the locals at a drag race, my first ever. A little of this goes a long way, but it was still a lot of fun. And who would want to miss the world's largest burl? Once refreshed, refitted, and resupplied, I would start back out on the water. Some days were good days, sunshine, lights all shining on me, beautiful paddling days. On those days, all I had to do was enjoy life, figure out where I was going and how I was going to get there. Although exercise, paddling can be very relaxing and meditative. Sometimes it seemed like the sea and the sky were inverted and I was paddling through the sky. I never knew what I was going to see around the next island or even where I was going to sleep, but that was okay. I knew it would come out right. The sun was warm but not hot, and the air was crisp and fresh. I was self-sufficient, independent, and totally free. Being out on a trip this long really allowed me to focus on being present and involved in the world around me. It didn't really matter what day it was. All I really had to worry about was shelter, food, and water. And staying safe. As long as those things were taken care of, the rest of life was gravy, and there was a lot of it around. I read Walden while I was out there, and this passage struck me as particularly true of me. He wrote, "In our most trivial walks, we are constantly, though unconsciously, steering like pilots by certain well-known beacons and headlands. And if we go beyond our usual course, we still carry in our minds the bearing of some neighboring cape, and not till we are completely lost or turned around do we appreciate the vastness and strangeness of nature. Every man has to learn the points of the compass again and often as he awakes, whether from sleep or abstraction. Not till we are lost, in other words, not till we have lost the world, do we begin to find ourselves and realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relations." I never really got lonely out there. I missed Jen, but I knew she was off on an adventure of her own, bicycling across the country. Every night I would send her my GPS coordinates so she would know where I was, and a short message letting her know that I was okay. I experienced enough rain in the beginning of the trip that I knew that these beautiful days were precious and to be fully enjoyed. It was always fun paddling underneath the overhanging pine trees. The trees would only grow down as far as the high tides would allow them, and when the tides were down, I could paddle along underneath the overhanging boughs. Not every day was sunshine day. One morning, I was headed back to Port McNeill to resupply because I was running low on food. The day dawned foggy, but I had to cross both Active Pass and the Johnstone Strait at slack that day. Active Pass is so named because it's a choke point for all of the big vessels, such as cruise ships, plying up and down the inland passage. It's not very wide, but it's really busy, and I had to cross it in the fog. I was pretty sure there were no cruise ships coming, because you can hear those things a mile away. I used my marine radio to locate and avoid other small vessel traffic, and crossed the strait blindly but safely. Once across Active Pass, the fog thinned out a little bit close to shore. However, as I paddled along toward the Johnstone Strait, I could see a big, thick bank of it looming before me. I was okay, but not comfortable with crossing Active Pass in the fog, but not the Johnstone Strait. It's wide, rough, and full of boat traffic, which makes it a dicey crossing even on a good day at slack. Because I had been able to cross Active Pass, I was right on time to cross Johnstone Strait at slack, which was just the other side of this island. There was no way I was going to cross Johnstone Strait in a fog bank. So if the fog doesn't lift soon, I was going to have to find a place to camp and wait for the next day. And just as God parted the Red Sea for the Israelites, when I got to the Johnstone Strait, he lifted the fog for me. In a miracle of biblical proportions, God lifted the fog for me, and I had a safe passage across the strait to a campsite where I watched orcas in the evening.
Some days, though, paddling was just plain hard. I'd be paddling against the wind and the tide and into the chop. Typically, I'd tuck in tight against the shore to avoid as much of the wind as I could. But as I came around a point, I'd get hit full in the face with it. This doesn't look that rough, but if I capsized, I might not survive. That might sound a little dramatic, but consider the fact that the water temperature is about 55 degrees. That's maybe 40 degrees colder than your body temperature. So if you get knocked over, you immediately suffer thermal shock and cold, salty water goes shooting up your nose. All this is very distracting when you're upside down trying to get out of the boat and back up to the surface. It takes me about 1.5 minutes to do that. Research shows you've got about 4 minutes before you start to lose fine motor control in your fingers in this temperature water. This would give me about 2.5 minutes to access and deploy my paddle float and get back in the boat before I started losing the ability to use my fingers. In practice sessions, I usually couldn't get back into the boat this fast. So if I couldn't get back into the boat and there was nowhere on land where I could get out of the water, there was a good chance that I would die of hypothermia before anybody found me floating around out there. So the most important rule on this trip was to stay out of the water. Because as a guy in a bar told me the night before I left,
But it was all worth it for times like this.
The sea does not care about you.
This is the scene that greeted me on my birthday in the morning when I got up. Not too shabby. And look, it's sunny. There are no clouds. That is a big, big deal.
About 4 o'clock, I'd start looking for a place to camp. I had a map with recommended campsites, but it was old and often inaccurate, so frequently I had to find my own. In these situations, I often found myself in beautiful surroundings, but with nowhere to land. Beaches can be few and far between in British Columbia. The land often drops straight down into the water, so the first requirement of finding a campsite is finding a place to land. When I found a beach, they weren't always beautiful. Sometimes they were rocky, slippery, and covered with sharp things like oyster shells. When I landed on this beach, I was surprised I didn't scare this gull away as I slipped and slid and flailed and cursed, hauling my boat up over the rocks. But he just looked at me impassively and uncaringly, even when I threatened to catch him and eat him for dinner. That was a tough landing. Once on land, I still had to get off the beach. I frequently had to climb over more rocks and through a thick salal underbrush. Salal grows 1 foot to 2 feet high and is virtually impossible to get through. But if you could get past the obstacles, the campsites were often stunning. I never knew what I was going to get at developed campgrounds. On the map, this one had a campground, marina, and seaplane base. After a hard paddle with visions of cheeseburgers dancing in my head, this is what I was greeted with: a sunken dock. And most disappointing of all was that somebody had already taken the only usable campsite. Turns out that person was Dominique. He was one of the coolest, most interesting people I would meet on this trip. In ways we were very different. He had paddled all the way from Victoria and was living off the land. But we were both exploring the wilderness solo and shared a sense of adventure. We got along great. I took a day off to rest, refit, and recharge, and just hang out with him. During that time, he taught me a lot. I spent another night with an unexpected campmate. I landed on this beach after a hard day's paddle late in the afternoon with the skies darkening and rain threatening.
The beach is composed of oyster and clam shells discarded over hundreds, if not thousands of years by First Nations people. After setting up my tarp and tent, I noticed that I was going to be sharing the site with the memory, if not remains, of Charlie Panquite, a First Nations member who had died in 1946. I explained my situation to Charlie and promised that I would be very respectful of his site. He must have been okay with that because I spent a very peaceful night there. I spent another couple of nights at this beautiful First Nations site. A couple from the sailboat in the background landed on the beach to walk their dog, and we had great fun swapping off-the-grid adventure stories. After 2 days, we all cleared out as a First Nations tribe was coming in to use the island as a youth camp for a week. At the end of the day, after I had set up camp and finished dinner, I'd explore the woods and the beaches. Some places like this offered not only whale watching opportunities, but the chance to find fossils among the rocks as well.
To end the day on clear nights, I'd watch the sunset, which I always had time to do and frequently were spectacular. So there you have it. I hope that gives you some sense of what it's like to spend some time in the wilds of British Columbia. I encourage you to find your own adventure, even if it's just going out to the park for a walk. Get out there and do it.